There are a few things more synonymous with Phantasy Star than recurring antagonist Darkfalz. All RPGs need a strong main villain, and Darkfalz, or Dark Force, we'll get onto that, is the epitome of that role in Phantasy Star. In this video, I want to take an in-depth look at the origins of Darkfalz, its appearances in some of the mainline games, and try to answer the question of just exactly what is it. Darkfalz's first appearance was, unsurprisingly, in the very first Phantasy Star on the Master System. It first appears in the nightmares of the game's heroine Alice Landale, where it's actually fought as a boss, which, funnily enough, is actually called Succubus. Yes, Succubus. Moving on. The fight is more or less designed to be a loss, upon which Alice will wake up. Darkfalz doesn't then appear again until the very end of the game, after defeating the evil King Lasik, who was actually under the influence of Darkfalz. Falz's appearance in this game is kind of one of a floating demonic looking creature with a mostly atrophied lower body. It's not a particularly interesting fight, to be honest. He actually only has one attack that he just spams every turn. But nevertheless, this is where it all began, and it kind of established Darkfalz as the series' main villain. Falz would appear again in 1989's Phantasy Star II, albeit now renamed to Dark Force. Now, I honestly have no idea why there's a difference in naming, and for the record, I don't know if Darkfalz was called Darkfalz in the Japanese version of the original Phantasy Star. But for the context of this video, I consider Darkfalz and Dark Force to be one and the same. They're more or less interchangeable. The way it's introduced is very reminiscent of the first game. So the main protagonist, Rolf, wakes up from a nightmare where he sees a girl fighting a demon, and if you've played the original Phantasy Star, you'll recognise it straight away as Alice and Darkfalz from the first game. Now, curiously, Dark Force doesn't then appear in Phantasy Star II until right near the end of the game, but it's likely that it was spreading its influence and causing a lot of the issues that are plaguing Algol during the course of that game. What you learn about Darkfalz or Dark Force is that it does work behind the scenes quite a lot and manipulate a lot of things, which you'll see in a lot of the games. Interestingly, Dark Force actually isn't the main antagonist of Phantasy Star II. That honour actually belongs to Mother Brain, which is another boss that also features fairly frequently in the series. In the second game, Darkfalz actually ambushes you out of a chest, and it will make you question every single chest you see in games going forward. Its appearance is quite different from the previous game, which lends itself to the theory that Falz is a creature that can regenerate periodically. Again, if you've played more or less any Phantasy Star game, you'll know that this tends to happen on a 1,000-year cycle. Darkfalz in Phantasy Star II has multiple heads and now has multiple attacks. It's also one of the most irritating fights in any Phantasy Star game, so have fun with that. So 1990's Phantasy Star III is actually quite interesting because chronologically it takes place after the fourth game, but in a completely different part of space disconnected from the Algol system. Darkfalz again makes its appearance in this game right near the end of the game. Hilariously, it actually waits in a chest again for you in the game's final dungeon. For the third game, its appearance does change significantly, and it takes on a form that more resembles a humanoid. The fight actually has some element of strategy to it, which honestly is saying a lot compared to most encounters in Phantasy Star III. Phantasy Star IV is where I feel that Darkfalz's lore really got fleshed out a lot more. You'll first see Dark Force when encountering the Black Magician Zio, who uses its tremendous power to stop you. Alice is mortally wounded in the process and ends up passing away from her injuries, which leads you to seek a rematch battle. Possession and corruption is kind of a recurring theme with Dark Force, and here I believe we see one of the first confirmations that Dark Force can infect humans. This is a theme that's used heavily in the later entries where Dark Force either controls another person, much like Lasik in the first game, or mutates them. Dark Force is first fought directly in the satellite Kuran, where it's actually fused with the computer systems, and this is probably the first confirmation that Dark Force also has the ability to corrupt machinery, something that again would be used significantly in later games. Now curiously, the first encounter with Dark Force does look kind of similar to his appearance in Phantasy Star II. Later in the game, you'll actually run into Dark Force several times. So next you'll run into it in Garabirk Tower on Dizolis. This is a grotesque tower of pulsating flesh that houses the second Dark Force boss, and again it somewhat resembles its Phantasy Star II appearance. This time though it actually makes a lot more sense because you learn that after Dark Force's defeat in Phantasy Star II, a fragment of it was actually left behind and sealed underground on Dizolis. Over the next 1,000 years, that fragment grew and eventually resulted in the creation of Garabirk Tower and its very sinister inhabitant. The third encounter with Darkfalz shows its intelligence and ability to scheme. Shortly after reaching the Soldier's Temple, you'll run into the archaeologist Seth, who asks to join you. Seth is extremely inquisitive, specialises in dark skills like corrosion, and seems intent on looking at the Aero Prism, which is a relic that you've recently acquired. It is clear that certain members of your party, most notably Rune, really do not trust Seth, and the truth gets revealed a little later when the blinding light of the Aero Prism burns away Seth's human facade, revealing him to be Darkfalz. There is some argument that Darkfalz merely corrupted the archaeologist, but I actually believe that Seth was never a human and was a disguise purely fashioned by Darkfalz instead. Darkfalz knew what you were planning to do with the Aero Prism and wanted to build your trust so that you would hand it over so that it could destroy it, or use it for its own gains. It's not often that we see this scheming side of Darkfalz, so I've always thought this was a really interesting development in Phantasy Star IV's story, and it's honestly probably one of my favourite interpretations of Darkfalz. Now, at this point, we probably need to talk about Profound Darkness. Profound Darkness first appears in Phantasy Star IV as the final boss of the game. It's explained that in ancient times there was a huge battle that raged between the light and the dark. The battle went on for thousands of years with no side claiming a clear advantage, until finally the Great Light defeated the Profound Darkness, sealing it away using the planets of Algol themselves as the seals. Every 1000 years, the Profound Darkness can manage to send a manifestation of itself through the seal, which is Darkfalz. So even with how integral Darkfalz is as a villain, it's actually merely a part of the greater whole, which is the Profound Darkness. Now, with the destruction of Parma in Phantasy Star II, the seal becomes weakened, and that allows Profound Darkness to establish more of a foothold in Algol. And that results in you then needing to take care of it as the final boss of Phantasy Star IV. So once Phantasy Star moved away from the classic JRPGs, Darkfalz would continue to be ever present. In Phantasy Star Online, Darkfalz, now renamed back to Darkfalz, appears as a god which was sealed away by an ancient civilization, which Pioneer 1 unfortunately ends up disturbing. This results in the death of all those aboard Pioneer 1, as well as causing several disasters all over the planet Ragol. Native creatures that were once peaceful become violent, machines begin to go berserk, and a giant worm mutates wide swathes of the ecosystem. PSO's incarnation of Darkfalz is also the first time that we see Darkfalz actually take over someone completely. Previously, Darkfalz's victims were just made to do its bidding, but now we see it actively absorb someone, in this case the heroine Red Ring Rico. While it absorbs Rico, the screaming faces of the souls of Pioneer 1 also adorn the boss arena, and parts of ruins if you look carefully enough. Falz's appearance in PSO shifts between forms, but it is notable for its first two forms having a humanoid centre body which actually wears Red Ring Rico's red ring. So it's likely that the mutated humanoid part of Falz is probably what actually remains of Rico. Interestingly, Falz's first fate also rides upon a multi-headed base, which actually reminds me a little of how Darkfalz looked in Phantasy Star III. Now this is quite interesting because there is a theory that the spaceship in PSO, not the VR spaceship but the crashed spaceship which forms ruins, is from Phantasy Star III. The monument also reads Mut dit Poom, which many have also taken to represent Motavia Dizolis Parma, which are the planets from the classic games. But Sega have always claimed that the RPGs in PSO are completely separate, so read into that how you will. For me, I see there are a lot of things that could link the games, but Sega seem to still claim that they are separate, so again, do with that what you will. Now, while Darkfalz doesn't appear in episode 2 directly, the hero Heathcliff Flowen is injured after a confrontation with Falz, and ends up contracting the D-Factor. In PSO, the D-Factor is kind of like a virus that can mutate the victims over time. In Flowen's case, he ends up being used as a test subject and fused with the Olga AI core, which eventually mutates him into the final boss, Olga Flow. Deemed too dangerous, he's abandoned in the test subject disposal facility under the seabed of Galderval, and appears once you reach the depths of the seabed. Now, PSO Episode 3 Card Revolution had a very weird way of introducing Falz. So the game reveals that the heroes from Episode 1 and 2 have actually been fighting Darkfalz and Olga Flow over and over again, caught in a loop. Somehow, the deceased Red Ring Rico and Flowen managed to cause Darkfalz and Olga Flow to resonate with each other, and they combine together, creating the Humar I&II. I have honestly never liked this ending. I like PS Episode 3, but I've always had issues with this ending. because I feel like it really lessens the impact of episode 1 and 2, and it does kind of feel like it's a ridiculous concept pulled out of nowhere. But hey, it's what we have. That is unfortunately how PSO episode 3 ends. This essentially ends Darkfalz and Olgaflow forever, in PSO's timeline at least. If we then move on to PSO Blueburst episode 4, this is one of the very few Phantasy Star games that doesn't feature Darkfalz as a boss, though of course you can still fight Falz and Flow in episode 1 and 2 respectively. The boss in episode 4 is some sort of alien life form that is connected to the meteor impact on Ragol. Now, the reason for Falz not being there, it's not a timeline thing necessarily, because confusingly, episode 4 takes place before episode 3, make it make sense. They did the same with the classic games as well, so Phantasy Star 4 takes place before Phantasy Star 3. They seem to like doing that, I don't know why. If we then move on to the Goral system games, this is where things get very confusing. So Phantasy Star Universe actually didn't include Darkfalz at all in the base game, but a very similar boss appeared instead. So when the antagonist Renvolt Magashi fuses with seed life forms, he becomes a being called Dulk Fakis, which is thematically extremely similar to Darkfalz. Now, as for why the name was different, this is something I'll never know. Maybe Sega want to differentiate the Goral games from the rest of the series, but wanted to keep something similar. Regardless of the reason, Darkfalz doesn't appear in base game PSU at all. It would take until the ambition of the Illuminous expansion for Darkfalz to finally make its appearance in PSU, and I remember being incredibly underwhelmed with it at the time. So when Darkfalz finally does reappear, it takes the form of a fish-like creature, and was honestly nothing more than a reskin of PSU's Durrell Lair boss fight. I actually forget which came first, but honestly the fights are so similar it barely matters. I've always seen this version of Falz as a kind of larval form that isn't fully matured. Later, we would see another form of Darkfalz, but even this was just a reskinned version of Dulk Fakis' final phase. I do question why Sega bothered putting Darkfalz in PSU, if all they had planned for it was reskins, but that was the reality of Darkfalz in PSU. Now the PSP games also featured Falz to some degree, but as they were all based on the Goral system games, most of the Falz variants were just the ones from PSU. The notable exception to this is the Japan-only Phantasy Star Portable 2 Infinity. Not only did Infinity feature PSO's Olgaflow, because it was released as part of PSO's 10th anniversary celebrations, it also had its own unique Darkfalz fight, which would form the story's final boss. This boss was called Darkfalz Dios, and looked completely different to everything we'd seen so far. It was great to see a new Darkfalz finally, and Dios was a good way of rounding out the Goral era, and remedying some of the issues that we had with the early games. Now if we sidestep quickly into Phantasy Star Zero, Darkfalz once again reared its head as the final boss of the story. Now in Phantasy Star Zero, the primary antagonist for most of the game is actually Mother Trinity, which is an obvious nod to both Mother Brain and or the Mother Project. Once Mother Trinity is defeated, it's actually revealed that Darkfalz was pulling the strings all along, who'd have thought. Now I have to be honest, I really dislike how Falz looks in Zero. It's kind of a weird elephant-looking creature that can also swim through the ground, and it largely attacks you using either spikes from the ground or these balls that bounce around the arena. It's not a particularly great fight, I really don't like how it looks. Now in the main story, it's not really explored why Falz is there, or what its purpose is. It's more employed as a kind of surprise reveal because you thought that Mother Trinity would be the final boss a la Phantasy Star II. I believe that it is explored a little bit in the side stories, but I haven't done those yet, so I need to get on that. Now, it's once we get to Phantasy Star Online 2 that the concept of Darkfalz was really expanded on to a ridiculous degree. In this game, Profound Darkness returns for the first time since Phantasy Star IV, or since PSO Episode 3, if you believe that Amplan Umbra is Profound Darkness. There is questions as to whether that is the case or not. Darkfalz also exists, but in PSO2, Falz actually can exist as multiple beings at once. By possessing different people, Falz can proliferate itself vastly, increasing the destruction it can wreak. Now what's really interesting about the PSO2 interpretation of Darkfalz is that the different Darkfalz fragments have their own distinct personalities, which is very much influenced by the host that they took over. Elder, for example, is mostly only concerned with feats of brute strength and power, similar to how its host Gittenholt was. Loser, on the other hand, is scheming, intellectual, and willing to formulate grandiose plans to bring down the Arcs. at one point even managing to turn most of acts against each other during the Code Abyss events. Double, or Gemini if you're playing on the global version, took over a set of young twins, so their personalities are very childlike. It actually, to me, makes them one of the most terrifying Darkfalz because they view everything as a game and have no real moral compass whatsoever. With some of the other Darkfalz, you could almost appeal to them. So for example with Elder, if you showed Elder your power, it would be more impressed with you. You kind of work around that. With Gemini, because they view everything as a game and everything is a joke and a laugh, because they act as more or less the same as children, it makes them this terrifying enemy that it doesn't comprehend their power. Apprentice is so complicated that honestly it probably needs an entire video to itself, consisting of several different hosts, depending on whether you count Eucreta as a real Darkfalz apprentice or not. Now, what I always loved about the interpretation of the Falz forms in PSO2 was that sometimes the Falz spawn they summon would also reflect their own style too. So for example, the Falz spawn that Loser summons are mostly avian enemies, which is similar to Loser's own bird-like appearance. Gemini's Falz spawn mostly resemble corruptions of children's toys and so on. It's a really cool way of further establishing the distinct style of each Falz fragment, and it really shows their personality. Finally, of course, we come to Darkfalz Persona, which is where things get really weird. So one of the big reveals in the PSO2 story is when Persona appears to you without the signature mask. It's such a huge reveal because it's when you find out that Darkfalz Persona is your character. Now, things are very complicated with Persona as it involves different timelines and things that could have been, could have not been. But it's a very crazy reveal when it happens, and I don't think anyone at the time really saw that coming. Profound Darkness even features in the story twice, once as a form that Persona takes, and the other as one of the final bosses of PSO2, actually known as the Primordial Darkness. In this regard, PSO2 felt like a love letter to the series as a whole. Finally, we move on to PSO2 New Genesis. Now, Darkfalz has appeared multiple times in NGS already, using different forms. First appears during the prologue of NGS, where it appears and completely destroys Aelio Town, also absorbing Aina's father, Garoa, in the process. This Darkfalz would appear again during the story, eventually defeated by the Heroes Party. An upgraded version of the boss would also appear, called Darkfalz Aegis. During the story, it's revealed that the Darkfalz you've fought so far were actually part of an experiment to prepare arcs for the return of the true antagonist, the Starless. Since then, we have seen a few Starless Darkfalz, such as Solus, Dalian, and Vile. Now, notably, these Falz do not seem to have absorbed anyone. I believe that the reason for this is that in NGS, the phrase Darkfalz is actually used as like more of a classification rather than a distinct enemy. Any monster with the strength to end civilizations is deemed a Darkfalz class threat. Now, this to me has really interesting implications for the story, because if they're calling these creatures a Darkfalz class threat, that implies they would know what a Darkfalz is. We know that NGS takes place in the future after PSO2, so this could be a record left over from the acts of PSO2. Ultimately though, Darkfalz is more just a label in NGS, for now at least. There is a major story update coming soon, so maybe that'll change things. Now, it's clear after going through all of the mainline games that Darkfalz or Dark Force are an integral part of the franchise. Similar to something like Ultimate Weapon in Final Fantasy, in that it reappears almost every single game. Now, while I haven't covered every Phantasy Star here, I wanted to cover a wide spread of games so that you could see the themes that run throughout. Ultimately, Darkfalz, and by extension Profound Darkness, are meant to represent darkness and destruction personified. Now, while yes, it's undoubtedly evil, it exists as a concept that knows nothing else. It's a vital part of the franchise and maintains the constant battle between light and darkness. One cannot exist without the other, and this is actually proved in Phantasy Star IV, as when Profound Darkness is sealed originally, the Great Light ends up disappearing afterwards. Both sides of the coin are inherently dangerous without the other, and they require each other to balance each other out. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look into Darkfalz and Dark Force. I personally can't wait to see what's going to happen going forward with this instrumental mega villain of Phantasy Star. With the NGS story starting to get into its stride, I'm really interested to see how they interpret Darkfalz, whether it will continue to be its own classification thing or whether it actually becomes an actual enemy. I'm really interested to see where that goes. I may do another one of these videos that covers Profound Darkness a bit more in depth, but I wanted to do this because I've always found Darkfalz to be a really interesting concept in Phantasy Star, and I love how it's represented in each of the games quite differently, yet although they are very different, they maintain strands that link them all together. There are always common themes that run through them all, and I really like that. As a franchise that has gone on for nearly 40 years now, to keep that consistency going between the franchise is really impressive, and I really like Phantasy Star for that. So yeah, we'll end that video there for today. If you have enjoyed the video, please consider either leaving a like or subscribe to the channel if you feel like it. You can also join as a member on YouTube or follow us on Twitch. I have an X and a Blue Sky that are both Section Skylight, and I also have a Discord server you can join as well, so feel free to join us over there. Let me know down in the comments as well what your favourite interpretation of Darkfalz is. I'm quite interested to read what you guys think about the different forms and which one you think it lays the biggest impression on you. Yeah, whatever you're doing, have a great week, and I'll see you guys next time.